All right, today we're going to tackle something that's, well, it's really misunderstood. We're talking about substance use disorder. We're going to go from the absolute chaos of a crisis moment all the way to a structured, compassionate plan for care. Let's really trace that path, and see how order can actually come from that kind of chaos. So, this is where it all starts. Picture it, an emergency room. And you hear this. It's just a moment of pure, raw desperation. I mean, this isn't a threat made out of malice, right? It's coming from this desperate, all-consuming need to avoid the agony of withdrawal. This is a reality of a crisis. Okay, so we're going to call him Mr. John Doe for our purposes here. But his story, it's anything but anonymous. It's a real journey, and we're going to follow it step by step. Because this is how we're going to understand how a clinician can look at a situation that just seems completely chaotic and actually start building a real path toward recovery. And that's really the first, most important thing to remember here. Behind every single diagnosis, behind every statistic you hear on the news, there's a person, a real human being with a story. And man, it is a path that shows just how fast a life can unravel. Think about this. Just 3 years ago, this whole thing started with a simple bicycle accident, a standard prescription for Vicodin. But then, just 6 months later, he's using any pill that I could get. A year ago, boom, he loses his job, loses his apartment, and for the last 8 months, it's escalated to heroin, which of course brings us to today, in the ER. The fallout from all this, it's just immense. He's transient now, crashing on friends' couches. His entire life is just a cycle of finding odd jobs for enough money for food and drugs. And here's the kicker, his family has no idea any of this is happening. And underneath it all, he's just drowning in these feelings of sadness and worthlessness that have been there simmering ever since that first accident. I mean, you look at all this, and it's completely overwhelming, right? The problems are all tangled up. Homelessness, unemployment, depression, the addiction itself. So where do you even begin to help? How do you possibly bring some order to this chaos? This is the fundamental question for any clinician walking into the situation. Well, the very first step is to figure out what you're actually dealing with. You need a name for it. And for that, clinicians turn to their number one tool, the DSM-5. That's the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. The easiest way to think about it? It's like the official dictionary that defines the problem. So the DSM-5 defines what we call a substance use disorder, or SUD. And this is so important. It's not defined as a moral failing or a lack of willpower. It's a clinical condition. It's all about a pattern of use that leads to real, significant impairment or distress. And to make that diagnosis, a clinician is looking for a person to meet at least 2 out of 11 specific criteria over the last year. Okay, so those 11 criteria, they're not just a random list. They're grouped into a few categories. The first big one is all about what's called impaired control, and it's pretty much what it sounds like. It's about losing the ability to control your own substance use. And right away, we can see Mr. Doe's story fitting right into this category. For instance, using larger amounts than intended, he went from a Vicodin prescription to street heroin. Check. Being unable to cut down? He told the doctors he agreed to detox, but the cravings are still very strong. Check. And that fourth criterion, craving. Well, the whole reason he came to the ER was that intense, powerful urge to get pills to avoid withdrawal. That's craving, plain and simple. So after impaired control, the next big category is called social impairment. And this is where we start to look at how substance use really begins to damage a person's life, their work, their relationships, just their ability to function day to day. And again, Mr. Doe's story fits right in here. That fifth criterion, failing to fulfill major roles, he lost his job because he was, in his own words, unable to function at work. And that seventh one, giving up important activities, he flat out says he has a loss of interest in things since his accident. It's a textbook example. So you add it all up. What does it actually mean? Well, in clinical terms, the number of criteria you meet determines the severity. 2 or 3 is mild, 4 or 5 is moderate. But if you meet 6 or more, that's classified as severe. And Mr. Doe, well, he easily clears that bar. So now, finally, we have a name for the chaos, a severe substance use disorder. Okay, but a name isn't a plan, right? A diagnosis is absolutely crucial. It tells you what the problem is, but it doesn't tell you how to help. For that, you need a different kind of tool, something that looks beyond the label at the entire person. And this is where we make a really important shift from the what to the how to. So if the DSM-5 is the dictionary that gives us the definition, the next tool, the ASOM criteria, is like the GPS. It's not about defining the problem anymore. It's about looking at a person's current needs to map out a totally personalized path forward. The real power of the ASAM criteria is that it looks at a person's entire life across 6 key dimensions. It forces you to see that it's not just about the substance use. You have to look at their risk of withdrawal, their other medical conditions, their emotional and mental health, how ready they are to change, their risk of relapse, and, this is a huge one, the actual environment they're going back to. Now, let's apply this to Mr. Doe. Instantly, you get a much clearer picture. Dimension 1, withdrawal, that's his most immediate problem. It's literally why he's in the ER. Dimension 3, emotional state, that highlights those deep feelings of sadness and low self-worth he's been carrying around. And Dimension 6, his recovery environment, wow, it's incredibly unstable, he's transient, unemployed. This tells you right away, you can't just treat the addiction in a vacuum. You have to address these other areas at the same time. Okay, so now we've got the what, the diagnosis, and the how-to, the assessment. But to really, truly understand what's going on, we have to zoom out and ask an even deeper question. Why? Why did this happen to him in the first place? What makes one person more vulnerable than another? And that right there is one of the biggest questions in addiction science. Because here's the thing, it's almost never just about the drug. It's always about this really complex dance between a person's biology, their psychology, and the world they live in. Yeah, so research points to 3 main ways this can happen, especially when we see SUD alongside other mental health conditions. First, you might have common risk factors, things like genetics or trauma that make you vulnerable to both issues. Second, a mental illness like depression could come first, and then the person starts using substances to try and cope, to self-medicate. Or third, it can go the other way. The substance use comes first, and it actually changes the brain, flipping a switch that activates an underlying mental illness. Now, if we think back to Mr. Doe, remember that little detail that his feelings of sadness started right after the accident? That's a huge clue. It really points toward that second pathway, the self-medication idea. The Vicodin was prescribed for his physical pain, sure, but it was probably treating his emotional pain too. And that created this incredibly powerful and, well, ultimately destructive cycle. So look, we have all these amazing clinical tools and scientific insights. We have the what, the how, and even a good idea of the why. But here's the thing, none of it works if it's all happening inside a culture that actually gets in the way of recovery. And this might be the biggest barrier of them all. There's a great quote from bioethicist Laura Williamson who says that so many barriers to treatment are rooted in this toxic interplay, where SUDs are just so heavily stigmatized. And that's the real poison here. Stigma creates shame. And shame? Well, shame keeps people silent. It stops them from ever reaching out for the help they desperately need. So really, it comes down to a choice. We all have a choice about the kind of culture we want to build. On one hand, you have a culture of blame, one that sees this as a moral failing, that just focuses on individual responsibility and builds up these huge walls of shame. But on the other hand, you can have a culture of empathy, one that sees SUD for what it is, a complex health condition, and focuses instead on building bridges of support, of hope, and of care that's centered on the person. And in the end, that's the question for all of us, isn't it? We have the clinical tools. We have the maps, the dictionaries, the GPS systems to guide the way. We absolutely know how to help. The real question is whether our culture is building the bridges that let people cross over to that help, or if we're still building walls that keep them trapped. What are we building?